The year 1875 baked Texas into a hard, cracked biscuit. The sun was not a gentle star, but a hammer, beating the land flat and pale. Rivers shrank to muddy veins, and the earth split open in 1,000 thirsty mouths. The wind, when it came, offered no relief. It was just the hot breath of the world, carrying dust that tasted of grit and smelled of sun-scorched leather and the ghosts of cattle long gone. It was a wind that scoured the paint from homesteads and rattled the bones of last winter's failures. Hope was a scarce commodity, something you measured in the depth of a well or the weight of a rain cloud that never broke. The land was cruel. Out of this bleached landscape, a figure moved. She was not walking so much as being pushed forward by the memory of what lay behind her. Her name was Abigail. Though she had not heard it spoken with kindness in so long, she barely felt it belonged to her. She was 22 years old. Her dress, once a respectable calico, was torn at the shoulder and hem, a map of her flight through mesquite and thorn. The fabric was stiff with sweat and dirt. Her feet, bare and blistered, left small, dark blooms of blood in the pale dust. Each step was a negotiation with pain, a silent argument between the body that wanted to collapse and the will that refused. Behind her, miles back now, was a cabin. It was more a cage than a home, built with rough-hewn logs that sweated resin in the heat. It was the place her stepfather had brought her, the final payment on a debt he could not settle with coin. He had not used the word sold. Men like him had softer words for their ugly deeds. He had called it an arrangement, a marriage to secure their future. But Abigail knew what it was. She had seen the exchange, the clink of poker chips replaced by the finality of a handshake. She had seen the look in the eyes of the man who won her, a possessive gleam that had nothing to do with the love and everything to do with ownership. The escape had not been a plan. It had been an explosion. It began with the sour smell of whiskey on his breath in the middle of the day, a common enough occurrence. It began with a demand that turned her stomach to ice. For weeks she had endured, a ghost in her own life, moving through the motions of cooking and cleaning, her spirit locked away in a deep, quiet place. But this afternoon, something broke. Maybe it was the relentless heat, or the buzzing of a fly trapped against a pane of glass, a sound that mirrored the frantic buzzing inside her own head. He had reached for her, his grip like iron on her arm, and the quiet place inside her shattered. She fought. It was a clumsy, desperate struggle, more instinct than skill. A chair went over with a crash, its legs splintering. He cursed, his voice a low growl of disbelief and then rage. She had twisted away, her hand finding the heavy iron skillet left on the hearth. She did not remember swinging it, only the dull thud and the grunt of surprise from him. He had staggered back, his hand to his head, a look of pure fury replacing the shock. In that small window of time, that heartbeat of an opportunity, she ran. She did not grab a bonnet or shoes or a canteen of water. She just ran, bursting through the cabin door and into the blinding, suffocating furnace of the afternoon. Now, there was only the road. It was not much of a road, just two ruts carved into the earth by the occasional wagon, stretching ahead until it dissolved into the shimmering heat. The sun was a physical weight on her head and shoulders. Thirst was a living thing in her throat, a creature with claws. Her shadow, a stunted and wavering companion, clung to her feet. With every step, the dust rose in a fine powder, coating her skin, her hair, the inside of her mouth. She kept her eyes on the horizon, a flat, unforgiving line that promised nothing but more of the same. But it was not the horizon she was running toward. It was everything she was running from. She thought of the man in the cabin. He was not old, but he was worn down by a life of casual brutality. His hands were calloused and quick to anger. His laughter was a harsh, joyless sound. He saw her not as a person, a woman with thoughts and a heart, but as an object, a piece of property he had rightfully won. The fight had not been about her saying no. It had been about his property daring to disobey. He would come for her. She knew that with a certainty that chilled her despite the heat. He would see her escape not as a bid for freedom, but as an act of theft. He would ride out to reclaim what was his. This knowledge was the spur that drove her onward. When her lungs burned and her legs threatened to buckle, she pictured his face, the set of his jaw, and she found another step. And then another. She passed the skeletal remains of a coyote, its ribs a bleached cage half buried in the sand. She saw a hawk circling high above, a patient predator riding the thermal currents. The world out here was stripped to its essentials, hunter and hunted, thirst and survival. It was a world without pity. A sound, sharp and sudden, made her flinch. It was not the sound of hoofbeats. Not yet. It was the snap of the frayed rope tied around a fence post, a rope that had held a gate shut for so long the sun had baked the life from its fibers. It finally gave way under the strain of the wind. The sound was small in the vast emptiness, but for Abigail, it was a gunshot of liberation. It was the sound of a bond breaking. It was the first note in the song of her freedom. The gate swung open a few inches with a low groan, an invitation to a path she had not seen before. She stumbled through it, leaving the semblance of a road for the open, untracked land. Her mind drifted. Images floated in the heat haze. Her mother, face pale and weary, telling her to be a good girl. Her stepfather, his eyes shifting away as he made his terrible bargain. The women in the nearest town, their gazes a mixture of pity and judgment, women who had found their own ways to survive in this hard country, mostly by looking the other way. They were all part of the cage she had fled. They were the bars and the lock. Now, there was only the land. The land did not judge. It did not pity. It simply was. It was vast and indifferent, a canvas of baked earth and pale sky. It could kill you with its heat, its emptiness, its lack of water. But it did not lie. It did not make promises it could not keep. It did not pretend to be something it was not. The land was cruel, but she had been taught cruelty by men. Now the land was her only witness, and as she pushed one bleeding foot in front of the other, under the silent, watchful eye of the Texas sun, that was enough. The sun had just passed its zenith, beginning its slow, cruel descent toward the western horizon. From the shade of his long porch, Zeke Carter watched the heat shimmer above the packed dirt of his yard. The shade was his territory, a small kingdom of bearable temperature he had earned by building the roof above it. He sat on a worn wooden chair, its back smoothed by years of leaning, a piece of bridle leather in his hands. His fingers, thick and calloused, worked methodically, rubbing linseed oil into the stiff hide. It was a quiet, rhythmic task that kept his mind from wandering where it should not go. At 40 years of age, Zeke carried himself like an older man. His shoulders had a permanent stoop, not from weakness, but from the constant strain of labor and the invisible weight of memory. His face was a roadmap of his life, carved by sun and wind, creased at the corners of his eyes from squinting at distant horizons. His beard was thick and dusted with gray, his hair a little longer than was fashionable. He had come to this piece of land after the war, seeking a silence that the world of men no longer offered. He had found it. The silence was absolute, broken only by the wind, the lowing of his few cattle, or the sound of his own hammer. He had learned to live with it, to wear it like a second skin. Solitude was a habit he had cultivated until it was as much a part of him as the ache in his back. He paused in his work, holding the leather up to the light, inspecting its pliability. It was then that he heard it, a sound that did not belong. It was not the wind or an animal. It was the tired, protesting groan of his front gate. He went still, his hands frozen over the leather. No one used that gate. The circuit preacher came by twice a year and used the main track. The occasional cattle drover kept to the open range. That gate, the one that opened onto the dusty track that passed for a road, had not been swung open in months. Zeke set the bridle piece down on the railing beside him, his movements unhurried but deliberate. He rose from his chair. the wood complaining softly under his weight. He did not reach for the rifle that leaned just inside the door. Trouble rarely announced itself by opening a gate. It usually came riding hard or not at all. He walked to the edge of the porch, his boots making solid, familiar sounds on the planking. He squinted into the blinding glare. At first, it was just a shape, a heap of something crumpled by the gatepost where the broken rope dangled. A dead calf, perhaps, strayed too far and overcome by the heat. He stepped down from the porch, the sun hitting him with the force of a physical blow. The dust was hot through the soles of his boots. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was not an animal. It was a person, a tangle of torn dress and dusty limbs, lying face down in the dirt. He stopped 10 feet away, his old soldier's caution kicking in. He scanned the horizon in all directions. The land was empty. The dusty track was empty. No horse, no wagon, no rider in pursuit. There was only the woman, the shimmering heat, and the immense, silent sky. He approached slowly. He could see the tangled mass of her dark hair, caked with dust. He saw the soles of her feet, a raw, angry red, blistered and bleeding. She was so still. He thought for a moment that he was too late, that the sun had already claimed her. Then, her shoulder twitched, a small, shuddering movement. She was alive. He knelt beside her, the heat of the ground penetrating the thick denim of his trousers. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. It was a low, gravelly sound. She did not seem to hear him. She pushed herself up with a groan, her arms trembling with the effort. She managed to get to her knees, her head hanging low. She coughed, a dry, rattling sound that shook her whole frame. Then she lifted her head and looked at him. Her face was smudged with dirt and tears, her lips cracked and swollen. But it was her eyes that held him. They were wide with a terror so profound, so absolute, that it seemed to be all that was holding her together. He had not seen fear that close in years, not since the smoke and chaos of Shiloh. It was the kind of fear that makes a body shake but keeps it moving forward, the fear of a creature running for its very life. Her gaze was not focused on him. It darted past him, looking back down the empty track she had traveled. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. She tried to speak, but only a dry rasp emerged. She swallowed, a painful, difficult motion. She looked at him again, her eyes pleading, desperate. "Get inside first," she whispered. The words were barely a puff of air, a ghost of a sound. Then, her voice trailed off, her strength failing her. She swayed, her eyes rolling back in her head. The words hung in the oppressive heat between them. Get inside first. It was not a plea for water, or for help for her wounds. It was a warning. It was a statement of priorities. Safety first. Shelter from whatever was behind her. Zeke did not need to know the details. The story was written all over her in her torn clothes, her bleeding feet, and the raw terror in her eyes. He had seen enough of the world to know that men could be far crueler than any Texas sun. He reacted without conscious thought. He slid one arm under her shoulders and the other beneath her knees. He lifted her. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of skin and bone and ragged cloth. He carried her out of the sun and onto the cool, shaded boards of the porch. He laid her down gently, her back against the wall of the cabin. Her head lolled to one side, and a low moan escaped her lips. Zeke went into the cabin. The interior was dim and cool, smelling of wood smoke and coffee. He ladled water from the bucket into a tin dipper and brought it out. He knelt beside her again and lifted her head, holding the dipper to her cracked lips. "Slowly," he said, his voice softer this time. At first, she could not seem to swallow. The water trickled from the corner of her mouth, tracing a clean path through the dirt on her chin. Then her throat worked. She took a sip, then another, her whole body convulsing with the sheer relief of it. He let her drink half the dipper before gently pulling it away. "That is enough for now." Her eyes fluttered open. They were clearer now. the immediate panic replaced by a deep, bottomless exhaustion. Her gaze drifted over him, taking in his weathered face, his large, capable hands, the quiet solidity of his presence. He saw a flicker of something new in her expression, a hesitant question. It was the first, fragile seed of trust, planted in a field of terror. Zeke stood up and looked back toward the gate. The empty road stretched to the horizon, whatever she was running from. It was not yet in sight, but her fear was a tangible thing. It lingered on the porch, a silent third presence. He turned back and looked down at her. She had curled into a ball, her arms wrapped around her knees, as if trying to make herself smaller, to disappear. He saw the chafed, raw skin on one of her wrists, the ghost of a rope or a restraint. He did not ask. The time for questions would be later, if it ever came at all. For now, there was only the unspoken agreement her words had forged. Safety first. He went back inside and returned with a worn wool blanket. He draped it over her shoulders. She flinched at his touch but did not pull away. He then sat down in his chair, not close enough to crowd her, but not so far that he was out of her sight. He picked up the piece of bridle leather and the oilcloth, his hands resuming their slow, methodical work. The familiar motion was calming, a small piece of normalcy in a day that had suddenly become anything but. He did not speak. He just sat, a quiet, watchful presence in the shade, a silent guardian between a broken woman and the cruel, sun-bleached world she had just escaped. He could feel her watching him, her breathing slowly evening out, the frantic edge softening into the rhythm of exhausted sleep. The wind whispered around the corners of the cabin, but for the first time in a long time, the silence on Zeke Carter's ranch was not empty. It was shared. An hour passed, maybe two. The sun eased its grip on the sky, and the shadows on the porch stretched out like long, cooling fingers. Abigail had drifted into a shallow, fitful sleep, her body finally surrendering to its exhaustion. The wool blanket was a strange comfort, a weight of kindness she had not expected. Zeke remained in his chair, the oiled leather now supple in his hands. He worked in silence, his presence a quiet bulwark against the vast, empty land. He was a man accustomed to watching, to noticing the small changes that signaled a shift in the weather or the approach of a stray animal. It was this habit of watchfulness that made him lift his head before the sound was even a sound, when it was just a faint disturbance in the air. He looked east, down the dusty track. A plume of dust, small and distant, was rising against the pale blue sky. It was moving too fast for a wagon, too purposefully for a dust devil. It was a rider, and a rider in a hurry. A cold knot tightened in Zeke's gut. He set the bridle piece aside, his movement still slow, still deliberate. He did not wake the woman. He simply rose from his chair and stood at the porch railing, his feet planted solid and wide. He waited. The dust cloud grew, resolving itself into the shape of a horse and rider. The horse was a big bay, its coat dark with sweat, its stride choppy and tired. It was being pushed too hard for the heat of the day. The man on its back was a blocky figure, hunched forward in the saddle with a grim, forward momentum. As they drew closer, Zeke could make out the details. The man's face was a blotchy red, flushed with heat and drink. He wore a dusty black hat and a shirt stained with sweat. A pistol was holstered on his hip, its butt worn smooth. The rider did not slow as he approached the gate. He yanked the horse to a skidding, dramatic halt, the animal tossing its head and blowing hard, its sides heaving. The man's eyes scanned the yard, settling on Zeke, then flicking to the crumpled form of the woman asleep on the porch. A look of grim satisfaction crossed his face. "I figured I would find her here," the man called out, his voice thick and slurred. He did not get off his horse, holding his position of height and authority. "You got something that belongs to me, Mr." From the porch, Abigail stirred. The man's voice, a sound that lived in her nightmares, had pierced her sleep. Her eyes flew open, wide with a fresh wave of panic. She scrambled backward. pressing herself against the rough log wall of the cabin, pulling the blanket tight around her as if it were a shield. Her breathing turned shallow and quick. Zeke did not turn to look at her. He kept his gaze fixed on the man on the horse. "She does not belong to anyone," he said, his voice a low rumble, carrying easily in the still air. It was not a shout, but it had more weight than one. The man, Jedediah, let out a harsh laugh. "The hell she don't. She is my wife. Took off on me this morning. I have come to collect her." He swung a leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground. He was unsteady on his feet for a moment, the ground seeming to shift beneath him. The sour smell of whiskey and stale sweat drifted from him, fouling the clean, dry air. He hitched his gun belt and started toward the porch with a possessive swagger. "You will stay right there," Zeke said. It was not a suggestion. The words were as solid and unmoving as the man who spoke them. Jedediah stopped, his hand dropping to rest on the butt of his pistol. "Now you listen here," Jedediah sneered. "This is a domestic affair. It has got nothing to do with you. You just send my wife out here, and I will be on my way. No trouble for you." Behind Zeke, Abigail let out a small, choked sob. The sound was barely audible, but in the tense silence, it was like a scream. Zeke's shoulders seemed to broaden. He took a half-step forward, to the very edge of the porch, placing himself squarely between Jedediah and the cabin door. He still had not reached for his own weapon, which stood just inside. His empty hands hung loose and ready at his sides. "The lady seems to think differently," Zeke said, his voice still level. "I do not see a wife. I see a woman who ran for her life. There is a difference." Jedediah's face darkened. The pretense of civility vanished, replaced by raw, ugly anger. "She is property. My property. I have a bill of sale, a marriage certificate. Paid her stepfather a good price. Now step aside before you get hurt." He took another step forward, his intent clear. He meant to come up onto the porch. "You don't buy people, mister," Zeke said, and his voice was like thunder rolling in from a distant storm. "Not on my land." That was the breaking point. With a roar of fury, Jedediah charged. He lunged for the porch steps, his hand clawing for his pistol. But Zeke was faster. He did not wait for the man to reach him. He met him at the bottom of the steps, moving with a speed that was startling in a man his size. He did not throw a punch. His first move was to slam the heel of his hand into Jedediah's gun arm, deflecting the clumsy draw. The pistol clattered to the dirt, in the same motion. Zeke's other hand shot out and grabbed a fistful of Jedediah's shirt. He used the man's own momentum to spin him around and slam him face first into one of the thick porch posts. The impact made a sickening thud, and Jedediah grunted. The wind knocked out of him. From her place against the wall, Abigail watched, her hands pressed to her mouth, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was terrified. But beneath the terror, something else was stirring. She had seen men fight before. She had seen the ugly, brawling violence of saloons, the cruel dominance her stepfather exerted. It was always about taking, about owning, about proving who was stronger so they could have their way. This was different. Zeke was not fighting with rage. He was fighting with a cold, focused purpose. His movements were economical and brutal. He hauled the dazed Jedediah back from the post and hit him once. A short, powerful jab to the jaw that snapped the man's head back. Jedediah staggered, his eyes glassy. He swung a wild, clumsy punch that Zeke brushed aside easily. Zeke hit him again, this time in the stomach. Jedediah doubled over, gasping, all the fight draining out of him. He fell to his knees in the dust, clutching his middle, trying to draw a breath. Zeke stood over him, his own chest rising and falling, but his face was a mask of grim control. He bent down and picked up Jedediah's pistol from the dirt. He checked it, then tucked it securely into his own belt. He then grabbed the front of Jedediah's shirt and hauled him to his feet. "Get on your horse," Zeke said, his voice low and dangerous. "And you ride out. If I ever see your face on my land again, I will not be so courteous." He shoved Jedediah toward the terrified bay horse. Jedediah stumbled, caught himself, and shot a look of pure hatred first at Zeke, then at Abigail, who was now standing. The blanket pooled at her feet. "This is not over," Jedediah wheezed, spitting a glob of bloody saliva into the dust. "She is mine by law. I will be back with the law." "You do that," Zeke said, his voice flat. Jedediah clumsily pulled himself into the saddle. He yanked on the reins, turning the horse so hard it whinnied in protest. He gave them one last venomous glare, then spurred the animal into a gallop, fleeing back the way he had come. Zeke watched him go, not relaxing until the rider was a diminishing shape in the distance. He stood there for a long time, watching the cloud of dust the horse kicked up. It hung in the still air long after the rider had vanished, a hazy brown stain against the horizon. It looked like the smoke from a battle. It felt like the promise of another one. A storm of a different kind was coming. Finally, he turned. Abigail was still standing by the cabin wall, her body trembling uncontrollably. He had expected to see fear in her eyes. The fear was there, a deep, residual tremor, but there was something else, too, something new. Her gaze was fixed on him, not with the terror she had shown Jedediah, but with a look of stunned, bewildered awe. For the first time, she had seen a man use his strength not to hurt her, not to control her, but to shield her. He had not fought to claim her from another man. He had fought to give her a moment of peace, a patch of shade, a chance to breathe. For the first time, she saw a man fight not to own her, but to give her back to herself. The trembling that shook her frame was no longer just from fear. It was from the earth-shattering realization that she had just been defended, and the man who had done it had asked for nothing in return. It was gratitude. So pure and overwhelming it felt almost like pain. The night that followed was long and filled with a silence that was different from the solitude Zeke was used to. It was a silence with two heartbeats in it. He gave her his bed, a simple cot in the corner of the cabin's single room, and took a bedroll on the floor by the cold hearth. He did not know if she slept. He lay awake for hours, listening to the night sounds, the call of a distant owl, the rustle of some small creature in the thatch of the roof. His rifle was leaned against the wall next to him, and Jedediah's pistol was on the mantelpiece. He was a man who preferred to be prepared, and he knew, with the certainty of a weatherman reading a storm front, that the matter was not finished. The dust that Jedediah had stirred up would not settle so easily. In the morning, the smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the small cabin. Abigail had risen before him, moving with a quiet, ghost-like efficiency. She had found the sack of flour and was mixing biscuit dough in a bowl, her movements hesitant at first, then more confident. There were dark circles under her eyes, but the raw terror had receded, replaced by a guarded, watchful calm. They ate in silence, sitting at the small wooden table. The food was a truce, a small piece of ordinary life in the midst of a storm. Zeke found himself watching her hands. Yesterday they had been instruments of a desperate fight. Today, they were dusted with flour, shaping dough, creating sustenance. After they ate, she followed him outside and helped him feed the chickens and draw water from the well. She did not speak, but her presence was a question hanging in the morning air. What happens now? Zeke did not have an answer. He moved through his chores with the same steady pace as always, but his attention was divided. One part of his mind was on the fence that needed mending. The other was scanning the eastern horizon, watching for the inevitable plume of dust. It came just before noon, when the sun was high and the shadows were small and tight beneath them. 2 riders this time. Zeke saw them from a long way off. He straightened up from the water trough, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Go inside," he said to Abigail, his voice calm. She had seen them too. A wave of fear washed over her face, making it pale beneath the dust and sun. She looked from the riders to Zeke, her eyes wide. "Go on now," he said, a little more firmly. She hesitated for another second, then turned and hurried into the cabin, pulling the heavy wooden door almost shut behind her. Zeke walked to the porch and stood there, waiting, just as he had the day before. The riders drew closer, and he recognized Jedediah's sweaty bay horse. The man himself sat straighter in the saddle today, puffed up with the authority of the man who rode beside him. The second rider was lean and weathered, with a graying mustache and eyes that had seen too much to be easily surprised. A silver star was pinned to his vest, glinting in the harsh sunlight. They stopped a few yards from the porch. The man with the star dismounted, his movements fluid and economical. He looped his reins around the hitching post. Jedediah remained on his horse, looking down at Zeke with an expression of triumphant malice. "Morning, Zeke," the lawman said, his voice dry as the dust under his boots. "Marshal," Zeke replied with a slow nod. "It has been a while. Wade." Marshal Wade's eyes moved from Zeke to the cabin door, then back again. "Jedediah here came into town this morning with quite a story. Says you accosted him on his own property, then followed him here and kidnapped his wife." Jedediah smirked. "That is right, and I want her back, and I want him arrested." Zeke's expression did not change. He kept his gaze on his old acquaintance. "You know me better than that." "Wade, I know the man I served with," the marshal said evenly. "I do not know the man who has been living out here alone for 10 years. A lot can change in 10 years. Now, Jedediah has a marriage certificate, signed and witnessed by the preacher over in Redemption. Says he and a Miss Abigail Miller were lawfully wed 2 months back." "He has a piece of paper," Zeke said, his voice flat. "I have the woman. She came here on her own 2 feet, half dead from the sun and running for her life. You look at her, Wade, then you tell me what you see." As if on cue, the cabin door creaked open. Abigail stepped out into the sunlight. She was trembling, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides, but she held her head high. She had wiped her face clean, and in the bright light, a fresh bruise was visible high on her cheekbone, a faint purple shadow. She walked to the edge of the porch and stood beside Zeke, not touching him, but presenting a silent, united front. Marshal Wade's gaze fell upon her. He was a man who dealt in facts and evidence, but he was also a man who had seen the aftermath of violence more times than he could count. He saw her torn dress, the raw blisters on her feet, the bruise on her cheek, and the defiant terror in her eyes. His own eyes, which had been neutral and professional, hardened slightly. "That is her," Jedediah said, pointing a grubby finger. "Abigail. You tell the marshal here that this man is holding you against your will. Tell him you want to come home with your husband." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The wind died down. The cicadas ceased their buzzing. Even the horses seemed to listen, their ears swiveling forward, their heads still. It felt as if the land itself had chosen sides and was holding its breath, waiting for the verdict. Abigail took a shallow breath. When she spoke, her voice was thin but clear, cutting through the oppressive heat. "He is not my husband." Jedediah's face contorted with rage. "What you lie, we were married!" "I was never his wife," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. She looked directly at Marshal Wade, forcing herself to meet his steady gaze. He bought a lie. "Marshal, my stepfather owed him a gambling debt. He could not pay it, so he gave him me instead. He gave him a piece of paper with my name on it." Her voice broke for a moment, thick with a pain that was deeper than any physical wound. "No one asked me. No one said a word to me. I was just part of the bargain." The truth of her words settled over the yard, stark and ugly. Jedediah began to sputter, a string of curses and denials. Marshal Wade held up a hand, and Jedediah fell silent. The marshal's eyes never left Abigail's face. "Go on, ma'am." "He took me to his cabin," she continued, her gaze dropping to the dusty ground. He was not a kind man. Yesterday, I ran, that is all. I just ran." She looked up again, her eyes flashing with a spark of the fire that had kept her alive. I was not kidnapped. I escaped. Marshal Wade stood there for a long moment, stroking his mustache. He looked from Abigail's bruised face to Jedediah's blotchy, enraged one. He looked at Zeke, standing solid and silent as an old oak tree beside her. "Jedediah," Wade said, his voice dangerously soft. "You have a piece of paper. This woman has a story that I can see written all over her. The law is meant to protect people. Jedediah, not to be used as a club to beat them with." But the certificate, Jedediah protested, his voice whining. "It is legal." "Some things are legal," the marshal said, his eyes turning to ice. "But that does not make them right. And what you have done here feels a long way from right to me. Now, I see a woman who has been mistreated. I see a man who gave her shelter. What I do not see is a crime. Not on Zeke's part. Anyway," he took a step toward Jedediah's horse. "I think it is time for you to go." "You cannot do this," Jedediah shrieked. "She is mine. She is not a stray calf you can brand and claim." "Son," Wade said, his voice hard now. "She is a human being, and from where I am standing, she has made her choice. Now get off this land before I decide to start asking some harder questions about that bruise on her face." The threat, unspoken but clear, finally broke through Jedediah's drunken arrogance. He saw that he had lost. He looked from the marshal's unyielding face to Zeke's quiet menace. He shot one last look of pure poison at Abigail. Then, with a savage curse, he wrenched his horse's head around and galloped away, leaving a trail of angry dust in his wake. Marshal Wade watched him go, his hand resting on the butt of his own pistol until Jedediah was out of sight. Then he turned back to Zeke. He walked over and picked up the reins of his horse. "I figured it was something like that," Wade said quietly. "Some things you see in a person's eyes. Zeke, we both learned that much. Did we not?" Zeke just nodded, the tension finally easing from his shoulders. The war had taught them many things. It had taught them how to read the landscape, how to tell the difference between the sound of the wind and the sound of an approaching enemy. It had taught them how to shoot and how to survive. But it had also taught them to recognize the look of a soul in torment, and to know the difference between a man who fights for power and a man who fights for what is right. It was a lesson that had cost them both dearly, but it was one that neither of them had ever forgotten. The marshal swung himself into the saddle. "You might have some trouble from this," he said, looking down at Zeke. "He will spread stories in town." "Let him," Zeke said. Wade nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. He tipped his hat to Abigail, a gesture of formal courtesy that was also a profound acknowledgement of her courage. "Ma'am?" Then he turned his horse and rode away, his back straight, the silver star glinting one last time before he was lost in the shimmering heat. The dust began to settle. The yard was quiet again. The trial was over. After Marshal Wade rode away, a profound quiet settled over the ranch, a silence deeper and more complete than the one that had existed before. The dust settled. The heat baked the earth, and the two figures on the porch were left standing in the vast, empty landscape. The immediate danger had passed, but its ghost lingered, leaving behind an unspoken question that was as wide as the Texas sky. What now? Zeke did not ask it. Abigail could not answer it. There was nowhere for her to go, no one to go to. The world beyond the flimsy gate was a place of judgment and danger. The world inside, this small patch of sun-beaten land, had been the first place in a very long time where she had been safe. And so, she stayed. It was not a decision made with words. It was a choice made with the simple, weary act of turning away from the empty road and walking back into the shade of the cabin. The next morning, she was up before the sun, and when Zeke came out, he found she had already fed the chickens and was attempting to work the stiff handle of the water pump. He did not say anything, just walked over and took the handle, his large hands easily coaxing water from the dry earth. He filled one bucket for the house and another for the horses, and she carried the house bucket inside. A routine began to form. unspoken and unwritten, born of necessity and a shared understanding that work was the only real currency they had. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. It was a life stripped down to its essentials, the rising and setting of the sun, the needs of the animals, the constant battle against the encroaching decay of a world built by human hands. The focus of their labor became the fences. Miles of split rail fences bordered Zeke's property, and they were in a constant state of disrepair. The sun bleached the wood, the wind worried it loose, and the occasional stray steer tested its strength. Mending them was a Sisyphean task, a job that was never truly finished. For Zeke, it had always been a solitary chore. Now, it was not. He found Abigail trailing behind him on the first day, her steps hesitant in the tall, dry grass. He stopped, turned, and looked at her. She just stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, waiting. He gave a curt nod toward the toolbox he was carrying. "Hand me the hammer." She did, and from that small exchange, a partnership was forged. At first, she was clumsy. Her hands, accustomed to the confines of a kitchen, were soft and unskilled with the rough tools of the ranch. She fumbled with the heavy wire, and her hammer blows were uncertain. Zeke was a patient, if not a talkative, teacher. He did not praise or criticize. He simply showed. "Watch," he would say, his voice a low rumble. He would take a length of wire and, with a few deft twists of his wrist, bind a new rail to a post. His movements were efficient, born of 1,000 repetitions. He would hand the wire to her, and she would try to mimic him. Her first knots were loose and messy. He would wordlessly undo them and show her again. He never showed any sign of impatience, only a quiet, steady focus on the task at hand. Slowly, she learned. She learned the heft and balance of the hammer. She learned how to drive a nail straight and true, how to twist a wire until it sang with tension. Her hands, which bore the faint, faded marks of old restraints, began to change. Blisters formed, broke, and healed into calluses. The skin grew tough. Dirt became ingrained in the creases of her knuckles. These were not the hands of the woman who had collapsed at his gate. These hands were strong. They were useful. They were her own. Sometimes healing comes with calloused hands. With each mended section of fence, it felt as if they were repairing something more than just a wooden barrier. They were building a fortress, not of exclusion, but of inclusion. They were defining a space where the rules of the outside world, of men like Jedediah and her stepfather, did not apply. Inside these fences, a person was judged not by a piece of paper or a debt owed, but by the sweat of their brow and the strength of their will. The silence between them began to change. Too, it was no longer the awkward silence of strangers. It became a comfortable, working silence, punctuated by the rhythmic thud of the hammer, the scrape of a shovel, the creak of leather. They learned to communicate without words. A nod from him was all it took to tell her to move to the next post. A gesture from her could ask for more water. They learned the geography of each other's presence, how to move in tandem along the fence line, how to work together in the cramped space of the cabin kitchen, their bodies moving around each other in an easy, unthinking dance. One hot afternoon, as they worked on a particularly stubborn section of fence near a dry creek bed, Zeke stopped and pointed. "Copperhead," he said, his voice low. Abigail froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She followed his gaze and saw the snake, coiled and still, blending in almost perfectly with the dead leaves. It was only a few feet from where she'd been about to step. He had seen it when she had not. He had been watching out for her. The realization was a small, warm thing in her chest. He pulled his pistol, the one he had taken from Jedediah, and dispatched the snake with a single, clean shot. He did not make a fuss about it. He simply reholstered the weapon and went back to work, but the incident lingered in the air between them. He was her protector, not her owner. The distinction was everything. In the evenings, They would sit on the porch as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The oppressive heat of the day would finally break, and a cool breeze would whisper through the grass. Sometimes Zeke would whittle a piece of wood, his knife making soft, shaving sounds. Abigail would mend their clothes, her needle dipping in and out of the rough fabric in the fading light. They did not speak of the past. Her life before the ranch was a locked room she was not ready to open. His life before the ranch, the war that had carved the lines into his face, was a ghost he did not invite into the conversation. Their shared language was the present, the state of the fences, the amount of water left in the rain barrel, the health of the horses. It was a language of survival, but it was also a language of hope. It was a language that looked forward, not back. He showed her how to read the clouds, how to tell which ones carried rain and which were just empty promises. He taught her the names of the constellations that glittered in the vast, dark sky at night. She, in turn, brought a quiet order to the inside of the cabin. She found a patch of slightly less barren ground behind the house and, using seeds she found in a forgotten tin, started a small, stubborn vegetable garden. She coaxed green shoots from the cracked earth, a small miracle of life in the midst of so much desolation. He had built a life of solitude, a fortress to keep the world out. He had not realized, until she arrived, how quiet his fortress had become. Her presence was not an intrusion. It was a kind of awakening. The sound of her humming softly as she worked in the garden, the smell of biscuits baking in the small oven, the simple fact of another human being sharing his space, it all began to fill in the hollow places inside him. He had shown her how to tie a fence knot, how to survive in this hard land, in her quiet, determined way. She was showing him how to breathe again. Love was not a word they would have used. What was growing between them was something older, something more fundamental. It was trust, forged in shared labor and quiet companionship, rising slowly and steadily, like one of her precious green shoots from the dry Texas dust. The summer deepened, and the land, if possible, grew hotter, harder. But the rhythm of life on the ranch had found its own steady, quiet beat. The fences were stronger. The small garden behind the cabin was a patch of defiant green, and the silence between Zeke and Abigail had become a language all its own. They had fallen into a pattern of shared evenings on the porch, a ritual that marked the end of labor and the beginning of a brief, earned peace. Tonight, the air was different. The day's heat had been ferocious, but as the sun sank below the horizon, it pulled the warmth with it, leaving behind a clear, cool evening. A three-quarter moon hung in the inky sky, bright enough to cast soft, silvered shadows across the yard. The stars, unobscured by city lights or even the haze of humidity, were a brilliant, scattered dust of diamonds. On the small table between their chairs, an oil lamp burned with a steady, golden flame, creating a small island of warm light in the vast, moonlit darkness. The gentle, rhythmic chirping of crickets was a constant, soothing hum, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves of the lone cottonwood tree by the well, a sound like whispering water. Zeke sat leaned back in his chair, his long legs stretched out. He was cleaning the rifle, his movements slow and practiced. The metallic click and slide of the mechanism, a familiar, almost comforting sound. He was not cleaning it because he expected trouble, but because it was a habit, a ritual of maintenance and care that was ingrained in his very being. A man took care of his tools, and a rifle, in this land, was the most essential tool of all. Abigail sat nearby, her hands still in her lap. For once, she was not mending or braiding rope. She was simply watching the night. She watched the dance of the moths around the lamp's chimney, their delicate wings beating against the glass. She watched the way the moonlight turned the dry grass of the pasture into a shimmering, silver sea. She had spent so much of her life indoors, a prisoner in one way or another. These open, endless nights were still a revelation to her, a gift she had not known she was missing. He finished with the rifle, setting it down carefully against the wall. He picked up his tin cup of water from the railing and took a long drink. He did not look at her, but he was aware of her stillness, of the quiet thoughtfulness in her posture. The silence stretched, comfortable and easy. It was in the middle of this peaceful quiet that her voice came, soft and questioning, not much louder than the whisper of the wind. "Do you ever get tired of being alone?" The question was so simple, so direct, that it seemed to hang in the golden lamplight between them. It was the first time either of them had directly acknowledged the central fact of his existence before she had arrived. It was a door she was pushing open, a door into his past, into his locked-away heart. Zeke did not answer right away. He lowered his cup and stared out into the darkness beyond the porch light, his gaze distant. He considered the question with the same slow, methodical gravity he applied to everything. He thought of the long years after the war, the countless quiet evenings just like this one, but empty. He thought of the silence that had once been a refuge, a wall against the noise and the pain of the world, and how, over time, that wall had also become a kind of prison. He had learned to live inside it, to mistake the absence of pain for the presence of peace. "Used to," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. He turned his head and looked at her, his eyes clear and direct in the lamplight. "Then I got used to the silence, made a friend of it, I suppose." He paused, and a small, almost imperceptible shift happened in his expression. The hard lines around his eyes seemed to soften, but tonight, he let the word hang there for a moment, tasting this new truth before he spoke it. "I kind of like the sound of company." The words were plain, unadorned. They were not a declaration of love, not a poetic sentiment. They were just the simple, unvarnished truth, and because of that, they carried more weight than 1,000 flowery speeches. They were an admission, they were an acceptance. In that moment, something fundamental shifted and settled between them. A line had been crossed, not on a map, but in the human heart. Abigail felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the gentle night air. It was the warmth of acceptance, of being seen not as a burden or a problem to be solved, but as a welcome presence. A small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time since she had arrived. It was a fragile, beautiful thing. He had had a wife once, long ago, before the war, a young woman with bright eyes and a quick laugh. The war had taken him, and a fever had taken her. He had come back to a ghost and a memory. For 15 years, he had been a man alone, a widower in spirit, if not in name. He had thought that part of his life was over, a book that had been written and closed. He had accepted his solitude. But now, sitting on this porch, in the quiet company of this broken, resilient woman, he felt a stirring of something he had thought long dead. This was not the breathless, youthful love of his past. This was something different. It was quieter, deeper, rooted not in promises and dreams, but in the shared soil of survival and mutual respect. It was in the cup of coffee she handed him in the morning, hot and strong, just the way he liked it, without him ever having to ask. It was in the way he instinctively moved to stand between her and any perceived threat, from a coiled snake to a stranger on the horizon. It was a partnership, a silent vow to watch over one another. He had not sought it, he had not wanted it, but there it was. He was no longer just a man on a ranch. He was a man with a household to protect, a garden to tend, a person to share his silence with, without a preacher, without a piece of paper, without a single spoken promise. The truth of it settled over him with the gentle weight of a warm blanket, in the quiet heart of a Texas night. Zeke Carter realized he had a wife again. They did not speak again for a long time. They did not need to. The words he had spoken were enough. They sat together, listening to the symphony of the night, watching the moon climb higher in the sky. The island of golden light from the lamp seemed to burn a little brighter, a little warmer. It was a beacon of hope in the vast, lonely darkness. No promises, no vows, just peace. And for two hearts that had known so much pain and turmoil, that was more than enough. That was everything. The fragile peace they had built held for many weeks, a delicate bubble of quiet work and shared silence. But the ranch was not an island. It was connected to the rest of the world by a dusty track, and that track led to the town of Harmony Creek. It was a connection that could not be ignored forever. The coffee ran out first, then the salt, and Zeke knew the flour sack was getting dangerously light. A trip to town was no longer a choice, but a necessity. He told her one morning over breakfast, his voice carefully neutral, "I have to ride in for supplies today." Abigail went still, the biscuit she was buttering halfway to her mouth. A shadow passed over her face, extinguishing the small light of peace that had begun to kindle in her eyes. The town was where people were, where whispers traveled like wildfire in dry grass. It was the place where Jedediah would have gone, his mouth filled with poison and lies. "I will be back before sundown," Zeke said, his eyes on her face, reading the sudden fear there. She said nothing, just gave a small, tight nod and went back to her breakfast. But the food had turned to ash in her mouth for the rest of the morning. As he gathered the few dollars he kept in a tin box and saddled his steady old gelding, a heavy silence fell between them. It was not the comfortable working silence they had come to share. It was a silence filled with unspoken anxieties, a return of the old tension. Before he mounted, she came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked small and vulnerable against the vast, empty backdrop of the ranch. "Be careful." "Zeke," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was the first time she had used his name. He just nodded, swung himself into the saddle, and rode away without looking back, though he could feel her eyes on him until he was a small speck on the horizon. Harmony Creek was not much of a town. It was a dusty main street with a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, and a handful of houses. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and what they did not know, they were happy to invent. As Zeke rode down the street, he felt it immediately. The change. Normally, he would receive a few gruff nods, a raised hand of greeting from a familiar face. Today, he got stares, hard, curious, judgmental stares. Conversations on the boardwalk stopped as he passed, then resumed in hushed tones behind him. Jedediah had done his work well. The poison had been spread. He tied his horse in front of Henderson's general store and walked in, the little bell above the door announcing his arrival with a cheerful, inappropriate jingle. The store was cool and dark, smelling of sawdust, pickles, and bolts of calico. A few men were gathered around the stove, though it was unlit, and they all turned to look at him. Mr. Henderson, a balding man with a perpetually worried expression, polished the counter with a rag. "Zeke," Henderson said, his voice lacking its usual warmth. "Henderson," Zeke replied. He handed the storekeeper his list: flour, coffee, salt, and some lamp oil. As Henderson gathered the items, the silence in the store was thick and heavy. Finally, one of the men by the stove, a rancher named Cobb, spoke up. "Heard you have got yourself some company out at your place." "Zeke." Zeke did not turn around. He kept his attention on the counter. "I do. Jedediah Miller was in here last week," Cobb continued, his voice laced with insinuation. "Told a different story. Said you were harboring his runaway wife." The word hung in the air. Wife, a legal, binding, possessive word. Zeke turned his head slowly and looked at the men. His face was like a stone, his eyes giving nothing away. "I am giving shelter to a woman who needed it. That is all." "Well, the law is the law," Cobb said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "A man has a right to his property." Zeke's hands, resting on the counter, tightened into fists. He could feel a cold, familiar anger rising in his chest, the kind of anger he had not felt since the war, but he held it in check. A fight here would solve nothing. It would only feed the fire. Some people, Zeke said, his voice low and steady, think a human soul is something they can own. They are mistaken. He turned back to Henderson, who was now bagging the flour with nervous, fumbling movements. Zeke paid his bill, his jaw tight. He gathered his supplies, gave a single, hard look to the men at the stove, and walked out of the store. The ride home was long. The sacks of flour and salt felt heavier than they should have. He was not just carrying supplies. He was carrying the weight of the town's judgment, the ugliness of their suspicion. He had built his solitary life to be free of this, of the petty cruelties and blind assumptions of other people. Now, because he had chosen to help someone, that world he had shut out was clawing at his door. For a fleeting, selfish moment, he felt a pang of regret, a longing for the simple, uncomplicated silence he had known before. But then he thought of Abigail's face, of the courage it had taken for her to stand on that porch and speak her truth to the marshal. The regret vanished, replaced by a grim, protective resolve. She was waiting on the porch when he returned, just as he knew she would be. He dismounted and began to unload the supplies, and she came to help him, her movements quick and anxious. She did not ask how it had gone. She did not have to. She could see it in the hard set of his jaw, in the way he avoided her eyes. That evening, the easy companionship was gone. A chasm had opened between them. They sat on the porch in the twilight, but the silence was strained, filled with the things they were not saying. He saw the way she looked out at the encroaching darkness, as if expecting the whispers of the town to ride in on the evening breeze. He saw the way she picked at a loose thread on her sleeve, her hands never still. The fortress they had built together suddenly felt as if it were made of glass. He could not stand it. He could not watch her retreat back into the prison of her fear. He waited until the moon was high and the crickets were singing their nightly chorus. Then he spoke into the quiet. They were talking in town. She flinched as if he had struck her. She kept her eyes on her hands, her shoulders hunched. "I knew it," she whispered. "What did they say?" "They said what Jedediah told them to say." He answered, his voice rough. "They said you were his wife, that you ran away, that I took you in." A choked sob escaped her. "I have brought you trouble. Zeke, I knew I would. I am nothing but trouble." She finally looked up, and in the moonlight, he could see the tears tracking paths through the dust on her cheeks. Maybe I should go before I ruin everything for you." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. Go after everything, after the mended fences, the shared meals, the quiet understanding that had grown between them. The thought of this place returning to its empty silence was suddenly unbearable. He reached across the small space that separated them and, for the first time, he touched her. He laid his large, calloused hand over her two small, trembling ones. His touch was not possessive or demanding. It was a gesture of anchoring, of solid, unwavering support. "Abigail," he said, and the sound of her name, spoken in his low, steady voice, made her look at him fully. "You listen to me. Your value is not something that can be debated around a stove in a general store. It is not something that can be written on a piece of paper and sold to the highest bidder. It is not something that belongs to Jedediah, or your stepfather, or any of those gossiping fools in town." He leaned forward, his gaze intense, willing her to believe him. "I do not see the woman they talk about. I see the woman who survived. I see the woman who stood on this porch, shaking like a leaf, and spoke her truth to the law. I see the woman who can coax a garden out of this hard ground and who knows how to mend a fence better than most men I know. That is the woman I see." Her tears flowed freely now, but they were no longer tears of fear. They were tears of a profound, heart-wrenching relief. "They can talk all they want," he continued, his voice growing stronger, filled with a conviction that came from the very core of his being. "Their words are just dust in the wind. Justice is not always about what the law says. Abigail, sometimes it is just about how one person chooses to see another. And I see you." He had made his choice. It was not a choice between his quiet life and the trouble she brought. It was a choice between hiding and living. He had been hiding from the world for 10 years. She had made him want to live in it again. She squeezed his hand, her small fingers gripping his with surprising strength. The chasm between them was gone. His words had built a bridge across it, a bridge made of trust and unwavering belief. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice still shaky, but with a new thread of hope woven into it. "We stop hiding," he said, a plan forming in his mind. Simple and terrifying and absolutely necessary. Hiding makes them think they are right. "Tomorrow is Sunday. We will hitch up the wagon, and we will ride into town together. We will let them stare. We will let them whisper. We will show them that we have nothing to be ashamed of." He looked out at the vast, dark land stretching away from their small island of light. "You can't hide from the world forever," he said, as much to himself as to her. "But maybe, if you face it together, it is not so cruel." The next morning was a Sunday, and the dawn broke clear and unforgiving. There was a solemnity to their movements as they prepared, a sense of two soldiers dressing for a battle they were not sure they could win. Abigail put on the only other dress she had, a plain gray garment Zeke had bought for her on his trip to town. It was simple, but it was whole, and it was hers. She brushed her dark hair until it shone, tying it back with a piece of string. She looked in the small, cracked piece of mirror Zeke kept nailed to the wall, and for the first time, she saw not a fugitive, but a woman who was afraid. Yes, but a woman who was no longer running. Zeke hitched the wagon, his movements as steady and deliberate as ever, but Abigail could see a tension in the set of his shoulders, a tightness around his eyes. He was taking his fortress, his quiet, solitary world, and marching it into the heart of enemy territory. He was doing it for her. The knowledge was a weight and a comfort all at once. When the wagon was ready, he helped her up onto the hard wooden seat. His hand was rough and calloused against hers, and she held on to it for a second longer than was necessary, drawing strength from his solid presence. The ride to Harmony Creek was a long, slow journey through a silent, sun-baked world. The clatter of the wagon wheels and the plodding of the horse were the only sounds. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say that had not been said in the quiet darkness of the night before. All that remained was the doing of the thing itself. As they neared the town, Abigail's hands, clasped tightly in her lap, began to tremble. She could feel the stairs before she saw them. They came down the main street, and it was as if a silent alarm had been rung. People stopped on the boardwalks. Faces appeared in the windows of the houses. The town's Sunday morning peace was broken by the slow, deliberate arrival of the outcast and the woman he was sheltering. The whispers started, a low, sibilant rustle that followed them like a trail of snakes. Zeke kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, his hands steady on the reins, his jaw set like granite. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store, right in the center of town. He did not tie the horse to the church post, separating them from the righteous. He stopped here, in the heart of their commerce and their gossip. He looped the reins and then turned to her. He did not offer a word of encouragement. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable but for the unwavering steadiness in his eyes. It was enough. She took a deep breath, held it for a beat, and then let it out slowly. She placed her hand on his offered arm, and together they stepped down from the wagon into the full, hostile glare of Harmony Creek. The walk from the wagon to the store's entrance was the longest walk of her life. Every step was a battle. She could feel the weight of 100 eyes on her, dissecting her, judging her, remembering the lies Jedediah had told. She could hear the whispers now, the words property and runaway and shame. Her first instinct was to shrink, to lower her head and hide her face. She felt her shoulders begin to slump, her courage failing. But then she felt the solid presence of Zeke beside her. He had not flinched. He walked with a slow, deliberate stride, his head held high, his gaze sweeping over the crowd without fear or apology. He was a rock in a churning sea of contempt, and she was anchored to him. Drawing on his strength, she straightened her back. She lifted her chin. She stopped looking at the dusty boardwalk and instead looked at the faces of the people who were judging her. She saw Cobb, the rancher from the store, his mouth set in a smug sneer. She saw women who had once offered her a polite nod now look away, their faces pinched with disapproval. She saw their condemnation, their fear, their certainty, and in that moment, she realized that their opinions were a cage far smaller and more fragile than any her stepfather had built. Their whispers could not hurt her unless she let them. They reached the porch of the general store. Zeke held the door for her, and she walked into the cool, dim interior. The few customers inside fell silent, their conversations dying in their throats. "Mr." Henderson stood behind the counter, looking flustered. Zeke walked to the counter, Abigail a step behind him. "Morning, Henderson," Zeke said, his voice calm and even, as if it were any other day. "Forgot to get some whorehound candy yesterday. The lady has a fondness for it." The simple, domestic request was a profound act of defiance. He was not just buying candy. He was publicly acknowledging her presence, her preferences, her humanity. He was calling her a lady in a room full of people who thought of her as something else entirely. Henderson, caught between his fear of public opinion and his long acquaintance with Zeke, fumbled with the glass jar, his hands shaking slightly as he weighed out a small paper bag of the candy. As Zeke paid, the door opened and Marshal Wade walked in, his wife on his arm. The marshal stopped just inside the door, his gaze taking in the scene with a quick, practiced eye. He saw the tension in the room, the hostile stares, the quiet dignity of the two people at the counter. A slow smile touched the corners of his mouth, hidden beneath his mustache. "Morning, Zeke, ma'am," he said, his voice loud and clear, carrying to every corner of the store. He tipped his hat to Abigail, his wife, a kindly woman with gentle eyes, gave Abigail a small, deliberate nod of acknowledgement. It was a small thing, a simple greeting, but in the charged atmosphere of the store, it was a cannon shot. It was the law, and the law's wife, publicly siding with the outcasts. The shift in the room was palpable. Cobb's sneer faltered. A few of the women looked uncertain. The solid wall of their judgment had just been cracked. Zeke nodded to the marshal, and then, taking the bag of candy, he turned and walked with Abigail back out into the bright sunlight. Their exit was as slow and deliberate as their entrance had been, and this time, as they passed, a few of the stares were no longer hostile. They were just curious. A few people even looked away, as if suddenly ashamed. They did not stay. They had made their statement. They climbed back into the wagon and began the long, quiet ride home. The sun was warm on their faces. The tension had broken, washed away by the simple, courageous act of showing up. They had faced the storm, and they were still standing. That evening, the sunset was a spectacle, a blaze of orange and gold and deep, bruised purple that set the entire western sky on fire. The light poured over the ranch, turning the dry grass to spun gold and the rough-hewn logs of the cabin to a warm, glowing honey. Zeke and Abigail sat on the porch, in their usual chairs, watching the day die. The world was washed in a light so beautiful it almost hurt to look at it. They did not speak of the town. They did not need to. They had walked through the fire together, and the bond between them had been forged into something unbreakable. He looked at her, at the way the golden light caught the curve of her cheek and the quiet strength in her eyes. She was no longer the terrified creature he had found at his gate. She was a woman who had found her footing on the hard, unforgiving ground of her own life. He looked out at the rolling pasture, at the fences they had mended together, at the small patch of green that was her garden. For years, he had seen this land as a refuge, a place to hide. Now, he saw it as a home, a place to build. It was a subtle distinction, but it was everything. Maybe love is not about finding someone new. It is about finding yourself in the silence beside them. He had found a part of himself he had thought was buried forever on a battlefield a lifetime ago. The part that could care, the part that could protect, the part that could share his world. She had found the freedom and dignity that had been stolen from her, not by fighting or running, but by standing still and claiming her own worth. The last sliver of the sun disappeared below the horizon, and the brilliant colors began to fade, softening into the deep, velvety blue of twilight. The first stars began to prick the sky. The land was still cruel, the wind still lonely, the summers still brutal. Nothing about the land had changed, but everything was different. Before, it had been a silent, empty place. Now, it had a heartbeat, and there were two souls to share it. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night. Like this video, and show your support by pressing the hype button so more people can hear this story.